Hello, everybody, and welcome to the July 12th, 2022 iteration of the Kubernetes SIG Windows community meeting. As always, these meetings are recorded and uploaded to YouTube, so be sure to adhere to the CNCF Code of Conduct. For anybody new here, that mostly boils down to just be nice to everybody. All right, we can jump into some announcements. Only announcement that I was really aware of was that Kubernetes, the 121 branch, is now out of support. So if you're running on 121, try to get off of that and try to adopt a lot of the newer branches. I believe the last set of patch releases was the last one. Now we can give space for if there's anybody who's new to the call or new contributors to, if anybody wants to introduce themselves, you could feel free to just add your name to the agenda, just talk here if you want to. So yeah, pause for a minute.
Can I talk? I'm new.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I'm Fabian. I am working at Cloudbase with Claudio. And so far, I've done some pull requests on the Kubernetes SIG Windows about the fact that kubeproxy for version 124 has some Docker shim flags that are currently not used. That makes kubeproxy crash. And I've updated the build scripts to not build versions below 122, since 121 is out of support. And I was trying now to make the build for the host process kubeproxy to build every version above 122, not just the 3 that are added in an array.
Great. Yeah, I saw some of those PRs yesterday, and welcome. And thank you for starting to contribute. Since that's where you're working at too, I'll also mention James Sturdivant he's done a lot of the work there too. He's currently out of office, but it would probably be good to say hi to James too. I know, yeah. Thank you for that. Do you have any other kind of questions for the group, or just want to say hi?
Well, I had quite a question. I mean, why is the kubeproxy for the host process kept with like 3 versions and not like all of them, like the build for the rancher, where it builds every version from right now 122 and above?
I'm actually not too sure about that. I know I've wanted to change how we build the host process container images for a while too now. I think honestly a little bit of it is just tech debt and not enough resources. But also I think we've talked about this in the community meetings before too, but we're really hoping that a lot of those host process images are very short-lived. And by that, I mean, we're hoping that those images do continue to live on in the project, but just not in the Kubernetes SIG Windows repository. Like we'd like to get the kubeproxy image for Windows building with the kubeproxy images that come out for the normal Kubernetes project. And same with all of the other images that get built there. So I think because of that, there hasn't been a strong desire to go and do a lot of updates to that. But if there is, somebody has more time and is willing to do that, I think that could be a great place to start.
Yeah, that makes sense, but that's only going to apply for future releases of Kubernetes 125 and further, but not for any of the previous releases 122, 123, 124. And especially there are going to be small releases until their end of cycle. So it might still be useful to build them until they reach their end of date timeline. And in addition to that, we noticed that there's any sort of GitHub action to build those images. So I think until now they were built manually. And I think Fabian is currently adding those GitHub actions to those automatically, which would lessen the load on us in the future.
Yeah, I've actually started that work once too, and I forgot why I put it down. First of all, yes, I agree with what you just said there, like with the need or like how having those images and the build process cleaned up would probably be beneficial. I just haven't personally had time to focus on that, and I don't know if other people have too. So they would be very welcome contributions. Two, for the automating of the building, especially with GitHub Actions. I think I've started that once and put it down, and I know James had some thoughts on that too. So let's just make sure we're in sync with James on all of that too. But I don't think anybody is going to have issues with adding more automation to this project.
Yeah, sounds good. I think we can ping James as well on Slack for this topic later
Yeah,
on.
and while we're on it, and I'll just maybe we can spend 1 or 2 more minutes here and then get to the agenda. One of the big issues, now this is coming back to me a little bit now. One of the big issues that we had with this was that the GitHub Actions and currently those images are getting pushed to the SIG Windows tools Docker org. And and James, but I think a lot of this was me, had wanted to not push images to the Docker Hub anymore and instead to use the GitHub container registry things. So if you go to Kubernetes, GitHub, Kubernetes, the org, you can see that there is packages, and then where is, oh, it's the Kubernetes SIGs org, and then packages. There are a number of images that get built here, and some of those images are coming out of the SIG Windows tools repository, like the CSI proxy, which we added, which is getting used in CapC, this event logger and things. The other images are were these ones. I think I picked this up and I made it a conscious decision to only support the host process favors moving forward. So we have the SIG Windows Calico node, Calico install, and kubeproxy. These images are set as private, and I have been trying to figure out how we can open these up to the public. I have started threads in Slack with Contribex and the GitHub management team and everybody, and even I think like Ben the Elder was involved, Ben Elder from SIG testing, and about how we can use this, and the conversations just haven't really went anywhere. So if maybe this is something that you could also work with us, Claudio, to get working. To figure out a story here, like where do we want to host these images? I don't think that we should host these images in the staging and the prod repos, because hosting, like essentially these are just redistributed bits. Like the Calico node has all the Calico stuff, and rightly so, the right place for this image is to come out of the Calico project. And I believe that there was also some wording in where these, like in the language used for what would be eligible to put in the Kubernetes staging and prod container registry repos, and just rehosting the Calico stuff with some PowerShell goo on top of that was not really it didn't fit the bill for that too. So that's why I wanted to try putting it in the Kubernetes SIG's GitHub container registry and say, you know what, this is something that we can make more obvious. It's, probably not going to be supported indefinitely, especially as Calico starts to build these images and things. But I couldn't find a good place to to host them for now.
Okay, so there's the extra reason why those kubeproxy images should be to be, how to say, included in the official kubeproxy image itself. So there's one less worry about it.
Wait, host process is GA, I forgot, or is it still beta?
No, so host process was beta in 123 and 124, and we've actually decided to keep it in beta in 125 again, and it will go stable in 126.
Okay.
The reason behind that was there are some breaking changes, some desirable breaking changes for how volume mounts are going to work. And when container D 1.7 comes out, the plan right now is that all the volume mounts that are set up by host process containers will set up the volumes in both the desirable way that we want to set it up, but still in the locations that are undesirable that are, and we can go into more details later about that.
I remember something about that. Yeah, because you demoed that. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to set them up in both locations, the new way and the old way, and that will be in container D 1.7. Container D 1.7 isn't scheduled to release until October, which is after
Okay.
the 125 release. So we're going to use 125 to document and add test cases and everything, and do validation for the desired behavior. And then there's going to be some period where we'll maintain both of the volume mount behaviors for back compat, and then at some point we're just going to drop that. So it's, once container D 1.7 releases, I think it's going, like, functionally it's going to be stable in as much as the behaviors that we have aren't going to be changing. But just the timing of all the project releases and stuff didn't line up right for that.
Okay.
I'll give an update on that next week if, with that too, if we didn't, because we were working on what the messaging would be for that up until enhancement freeze, and then I went on vacation for 2 weeks, so that didn't happen.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah. Okay, next, or I guess first or second item on the agenda is this is something that I had worked with a little bit with Danny on, and I wanted some feedback from the community on this too. So some background is that normally when you create a Windows Server container, the volume that's created for that container is hard coded. It's like set at 20 gigs, that scratch space. And with Docker, there was a way to set that for containers as they start. There was a flag that you could set on the Docker daemon that would change that for all containers. And there was also a command line argument that you could pass to Docker CLI that would set that to just one for just the containers. And that's this storage opt size. And there's more details in this PR about what exactly happens with that.
So this is like you made a new container with, this isn't a persistent volume. This is just the amount of storage that to scratch.
Yep.
That is there for the image to write to, like in temp directories and stuff.
Yeah. Essentially the C drive when you're inside the container. So we found that there's some people that needed to do, processing of large data, and for whatever reason didn't want or weren't using volume, like persistent volumes.
Yeah.
So what we had done in 120, where's the agenda? What we had done in 124 was we added a CRI field that would allow that to be set, and then container D 1.7 actually will, when that's set, it will configure that too. What this PR does then is this PR lights it up in the kubelet. So where I think the feedback I want to come from is like, how do we want to expose that in the deployment specs? For the purposes of just having something to start the conversations with, I updated the kubelet behavior in this PR so that if you set a limit for ephemeral storage on the container spec, that will dictate the size of that scratch volume. With the caveat that there's a limit or a minimum file size requirement of 20 gigs, and that's in the OS. So you could set it higher, but not lower. To me, especially reading the docs of the ephemeral storage, it seemed like it was a nice parallel for Windows, since that does kind of set how much space is available for that container to use. Then the conversation here, and I did ask some people from SIG storage. I probably will go to SIG storage and ask for some opinions too. But the questions are like, is using an ephemeral storage limit the correct behavior here? Would requests make more sense given how eviction works? And I think James highlighted some of this too. It says if you're using evictions, then the kubelet measures the storage for the pod for empty dir volumes, the tempfs are also the directories that are created on behalf of holding the node logs, the writable container layers, which is what we're talking about here, and whatnot. So it may be possible to accidentally trigger eviction if you're using empty dirs in the pod and you didn't fill up your ephemeral storage limit here. I think so. That's kind of the crux of the.
I thought that request basically mentions a minimum required amount of resources, meaning that you can go over that amount, which from what I understood from what you were saying, you want to limit to that point, not over it, right?
Yes. So possibly, yeah, one option that I had here too was, like if it makes sense, we could just set this to a resource request for that storage limit. And then they can set the limit higher to account for anything that they need from the node level logs or the empty dirs. I think either way, SIG storage is probably going to, we're going to want SIG storage's input on this. But I think it might be good to have SIG Windows come up with.
Is it ever a good idea to extend this? Or is it always a bad idea? Like, is it always better to just do a persistent volume if you have a large amount of files you're storing on a Windows node? I'm not trying to say this isn't cool that y'all are doing this. Clearly we need it, but I'm just wondering.
I would probably say if you're going to re-architect your workloads, it probably would make more sense to do like an empty dir or persistent volume.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because that's how it is on Linux. Yeah.
Yeah. This did come in as a request from other users and actually
definitely.
flagged it as a, container D Docker shim parity gap.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
So I think that there are people who are used to running their containers in elsewhere that are relying on this behavior.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't want to derail the thing Claudio was asking. Sorry. Go ahead. What was the thing you were saying, Claudio?
I think at the very least there should be a request, because again, I think the requirement was that you want people to use at least that amount of data. But then again, you still want to set some upper limits so it won't actually ends up consuming everything on that node. So you might actually end up with some sort of DDoS attack for some reason, denying all the storage on the node itself.
Yeah, the interest, like this is just an argument. I'm not saying like this is the right argument, but the argument that I could make with that is that on Windows, it's not, once that volume is created, it's not possible to extend the size past that. So if you were to say, I want a pod or that has a container that has a request of 30 gigabytes for that writable volume, for that writable layer, that's the size of that writable layer is 30 gigabytes and there's no way to expand past that.
Okay, that makes sense.
So that if we're looking at it in isolation for just that one container, I think that limit is maybe like more to the spirit of what that is. But given that the kubelet uses limits for things like eviction and other things beyond that writable layer are taken into that computation, I don't know if it's like, I think we just want to come to a consensus if it's better to, say, yeah, even though it's a value for the request here, it actually is the upper limit, but we're doing this so that we can have consistency with how the eviction limits are calculated versus saying,
well, in the end, it could be requests that we set, but we are setting in container deep limits, for example. Then you won't have any sort of evictions getting triggered in any sort of case, right?
You could still, if you set like, so let's say you have a pod with one container. And that one container sets a request of 30 gigabytes and a limit of 30 gigabytes. If in that case, unless you have an exorbitant amount of logs getting written, you wouldn't trigger eviction. But if you add empty dirs into the picture, what could happen is you say, I have a container or a pod with a container, and that container has a writable request limit or writable request size of 30 gigabytes. And I have a 10 gigabyte empty dir. The way that the storage limits for the threshold for eviction gets calculated is it adds up the empty dir volume size and the writable layer volume sizes. So in this case, you could expect to have 40 gigabytes of storage. You'd have 10 gigabytes of storage from the empty dir and 30 from your writable size. If you set a limit for this ephemeral storage of 35 gigabytes, for example, once you hit 35 gigabytes in a sum coming from either what you've written to empty dir or that writable layer size, you trigger eviction. So it could be a little bit confusing in that sense.
Yeah, I think something like this should be discussed with SIG nodes as well, because it's not something that we can decide purely on our own, because the behavior for eviction should match with how Linux does it as well. So we don't have different behaviors for Windows and different behavior for Linux regarding the ephemeral volume resource limits.
Yeah, I think that who all has been added to here? I think I've added some of the storage folks. I don't know if anybody from Node has been added to take a look. They obviously would need to review it. And then I did ask, I had a conversation about this with Jordan also, and was waiting for him to chime in. So I'll probably solicit some more feedback and see if anybody from Node can weigh in too.
I mean, in general, why does it need to match what we do for Linux? In my opinion, I don't think it matters that much. I mean, it'd be great if it did, but I don't think it's a big deal, really. I mean, we don't have density parity between Windows and Linux right now. It wouldn't be a regression if if you know, if this somehow continued to not give us that.
I mean, sure, but I think that the fact that some things behave differently on Windows just makes it so much more difficult for other people to get into Windows, because they simply have to know all those little stuff differently that's happening.
I'm not saying that we shouldn't give it parity. I'm just saying I don't think it's that important for it to have parity, right? Like,
so
that's
like, I think it's desirable if we can make it as consistent as possible, but not a hard requirement. Is that
yeah? Like, I don't think it would make a huge difference if it didn't, you know. I think the parity question is just such a hard question to ask that, you know, I don't know what the most important things are when it comes to reaching parity.
Yeah, and then it's like what you just
But
said.
I don't think it's this. Go on, yeah.
I think something's with this, something's not going to have parity. It's either the behavior of if you set the requests, that's the size you get and it's fixed, or how eviction works. So which one is more important to have the parity in, and which one can we document that saying this is how it's different, I think is the conversation to have now.
I don't think we even have E2E tests for ephemeral storage limits and evictions related to that.
Yeah,
I only remember for CPU and memory.
I think that would be the higher priority at some point, is to like have that defined as a standard, and then
that would basically
then it would make it easier to have debates like this.
Yeah, that would basically make it a standard, to say so.
I think that I think that makes sense too. That's something that maybe I can pick up in a
I
little
guess what
bit.
I'm saying is my thought is 109.702 shouldn't be blocked on parity. That's what I'm saying. Like, it seems like this is a concrete step forward that unblocks an actual thing that an actual person wants to do.
Mhm.
We shouldn't block it on a non-concrete thing that we're not sure is actually that important. That's the way I look at this. I'll leave that comment in the PR 109.702.
Yeah, and then take a look, Claudio, and if you could add some comments too, that I think that would be helpful, and then I'll bring it to Node and storage and see what they say too.
Yeah.
Or anybody who has thoughts on it too, obviously, not just Claudio, but
1097.02.
all right, we're almost out of time. One thing that I did want to mention that I added to this is for anybody who was in the call beforehand. So a while ago, David Schott had done some work to add some syncing or caching for the Q-proxy rules, and that was meant to really, we found that if you had a lot of services in a cluster, it could take sometimes up to an hour and a half to sync proxy rules in your cluster when a new node came online, and that you just had undeterministic networking behavior until that happened. So in 125, we put in some changes to do caching for that, and those changes were only validated the container decode pass. We backported the fixes. Initially found out that there were some issues, or that we broke some functionality with Docker shim, and backed those out, and then fixed that up and redid those PRs. But since then, we've noticed that in the release branches, there's been some instability. And in order to try and get a sense of how unstable it is, James made another, we upped the frequency of the test passes to every 3 hours for 122 and 123. And then we made another test pass that was targeting the commit right before those Q-proxy changes. And it does look like the one right before the changes is more stable. So for example, this is it's not perfect. This is the test pass before the Q-proxy caching changes went in. This is the test pass after the Q-proxy caching changes went in. So it looks like it's a little bit more stable, or more.
But a lot of those failures don't look like they're even using the.
Yeah,
Oh,
I know. So one of the things is, and I was hoping when James comes back too, we'll probably need to make a decision if we want to keep those changes or pull them out and figure out what's going on here.
I mean, can you go back to the
So here's the 123 branch.
failing tests?
Yeah. So this is the 123. This is without the changes, and it
Yeah.
looks pretty good.
Yeah.
There's a couple ones. Should delete a collection of pods. I think that's kind of a known flake. And then the container probe, and then here's with the changes. And it is a little bit more, especially here.
Oh, okay, yeah, just hold it steady let's look at one of the ones that's flaky. So let's look at the tests that are failing. So, okay, so let's look. So you got DNS should support configurable pod DNS servers. Pods should delete a collection of pods. Service accounts, OIDC.
This one is,
Admission
we have some
webhooks.
other issues. It may be related to networking, but the OIDC one that one's been flaky all along.
So the only thing I could think of is its CPU usage. It's not an actual, that's if I had to guess, because we're not seeing more flakes in the services tests, right? Well, maybe this DNS one.
I think it could be DNS too, because I think that what could be what was happening is until those rules are programmed into the Q-proxy on the node, one of the symptoms was you would get unable to find nodes. So
but this DNS rule is not failing.
Yeah.
Can you just post that link that you're on in the Zoom or Slack or something so I can independently look at the tests that are failing?
I'm gonna add it to the meeting notes.
Okay, meeting notes, perfect.
I need to drop
I'm there. Okay,
pretty
cool.
soon, so I'll end the meeting and then I'll add them to the meeting notes.
Okay, I mean, I'll look at this for a while if folks want to stay on. I'll look at this for another 10 minutes or so.
All right. All right. Thanks everybody for joining, and we'll see you all next week. Where's my Zoom controls?
Cool. Thanks, Mark.